Coming up this week on the GCN Racing News Show, we will take a look at the astonishing powers produced by the pro riders who took part in the virtual Tour of Flanders. We're also, through the use of statistics, going to find out which classic really is the hardest, and we'll round up everything else that's been happening in the world of racing without racing. First up, the virtual Tour of Flanders. So yesterday, 13 top pros lined up for an online race set up by the race organisers, Flanders Classics, in conjunction with Be Cool. The participants raced over the final 32 kilometres of the race. Last year's winner, Alberto Bettiol, didn't get off to the best of starts. He was dropped at the beginning, but did eventually get himself back into contention. Just a few kilometres into the race, 6 riders had formed a group at the front: Oliver Naesen, Greg van Avermaet, Thomas de Gendt, Bettiol, Remco Evenepoel and Nico Roche. Over the top of the Quaremont, Evenepoel and de Gendt had a slight advantage, whilst at the same point Michael Matthews succumbed to a mechanical. He got stuck in the 11th sprocket, and there are of course no team mechanics on hand in the world of virtual racing, although maybe there will be in the future. Imagine that, a mechanic by your side in the garage in case something goes wrong. The Belgian duo were brought back before the Paterberg, and Evenepoel was paying for his effort, getting distance from the lead group, whilst Van Avermaet was making a move off the front. And it proved to be a decisive one. His lead rose slowly and surely as the kilometres ticked by, pushing well over 450 watts as he did so. His lead was 18 seconds with 3 kilometres to go, and despite the best efforts of Naesen, he wasn't able to prevent Van Avermaet taking his first win at the Tour of Flanders. Nico Roche did a great ride to take the final spot on the podium, whilst de Gendt took his first ever top 10 in a monument, and Jasper Stuyven rounded out the top 5. I jest about the monument and the first Tour of Flanders win, of course. This was just something a bit different for the riders to do, and for us to watch whilst we're in this situation. And I enjoyed watching it, partly because I am crying out for some sort of cycling competition to watch, and partly because I found it thoroughly entertaining. Now, whether or not I would do for the 2nd, 3rd or 20th time of watching, I really don't know, but maybe I will find out. The most disappointing thing though, as Larry Warbass pointed out on Twitter, was the victory salute, or lack of. Come on Greg, you could have gone really over the top with that one. One of the most intriguing parts of the race though was looking at each rider's home setup. Some looked to be in their bedrooms, some in their living rooms, a couple were in their garage, whilst Evenepoel chose to ride outside. Meanwhile, Oliver Naesen appeared to be in a bunker fit for a world war. Well, apparently it's his basement, but that is some pain cave right there. The other, even more interesting part was seeing top riders' power data. We were regularly seeing them putting out over 500 watts, and Van Avermaet appeared to average 434 watts for the 43 minutes that it took him to win. Bloody impressive that, I must say, even though he is a relatively big classics rider. So he's listed on the internet at 75 kilograms, which makes that effort a little under 6 watts per kilo, and it was more than that towards the end for his race-winning move. Anyway, we would love to know what your thoughts are on virtual racing. That is this week's poll, which you'll find over on the GCN app. Do you love it, hate it, or tolerate it whilst there's nothing else on? Let us know. You can find a link to that on the screen right now. We are going to move on now to a discussion about which classic is the hardest. So at this point in time, we should be in the middle of what some cycling fans refer to as the Holy Week. One of the most anticipated weeks of the year, where we're treated to the Tour of Flanders on one weekend, followed by the Queen of the Classics, Paris-Roubaix, the following Sunday. 2 of the toughest and most exciting races on the calendar back to back. And whilst over in the GCN App we've been running a series of polls to determine who is the greatest classics rider of all time, it did get us thinking about which is the greatest classic of them all too. Now, as a starting point, it seems to make sense that whatever the answer it is, it should be one of the 5 monument classics, they being Milano-San Remo, the Tour of Flanders, Paris-Roubaix, Liège-Bastogne-Liège, and finally the Tour of Lombardy. They are considered the monuments for a very good reason, and simply the level of prestige they've got now makes them harder and tougher than any other races. More riders have these races as specific goals during the season, and therefore winning one can define a career. Now naturally, like myself, you are probably inclined to think that the greatest race is one of the 2 races from Holy Week that I've just mentioned. For me, anyway, Flanders and Roubaix are the two that I immediately think of when I hear the word classic, and they're the only two that contain cobbles. But maybe it's too difficult to define what is great. Perhaps figuring out which one is hardest is a bit more achievable. Now, there are plenty of anecdotes supporting the claim of one of the other three monuments being the hardest. Former race director Angelo Zomagnan used to say that the Tour of Lombardy is the hardest monument and that hard is great. Mark Cavendish has said about Milan-San Remo that it's the easiest to finish, but the hardest to win. And although it sometimes feels like Liège-Bastogne-Liège has lost a bit of its lustre in recent years, plenty of current professionals will still tell you that it's got the hardest and most demanding route of the five. So, how do we determine which one of the five is the hardest? Well, one measure we've come up with is the average number of times a rider needs to race one before they go on to win it. If a race as hotly contested as one of the five monuments is won by a rider who has rocked up to the race for the first time ever, with no previous first-hand experience of what it takes to win, then surely that's an easier race than one which takes years to get to grips with. One more anecdote before we dive into some statistics. So a former rider wrote in his autobiography that one of the hardest experiences of his career was riding Paris-Roubaix for the very first time. This is what he said. I had ridden the cobblestones in Belgium at races like Ghent-Wevelgem, but nothing prepared me for what lay in store at Paris-Roubaix. I didn't even get a sneak preview of the pavé before the race because the rest of the team trained on the cobbles on the Friday whilst I was still travelling there. Afterwards, I knew why no one had offered any words of advice before the start. There was nothing anybody could have said to make it any easier. I crashed 3 or 4 times on the first few sections of cobbles without doing any serious damage to myself or the bike. But I was miles behind the front group of the race and we'd barely started. Believe it or not, that rider was Sean Kelly, someone who is often referred to now as King Kelly, primarily because of his ability over the cobblestones. But he clearly struggled with them at first. He did eventually go on to win Paris-Roubaix on 2 occasions, but the first of those victories came a full 6 years after that bone-shaking experience back in 1978. So, how many times does it take a rider, on average, to win each of the 5 monument classics? Let's delve into those numbers now. We've taken a look at the last 50 years of monument classics and worked out for each one how many times each winner had previously ridden the race before they finally won it. So, on average, it takes a rider almost 5 participations before they end up winning Paris-Roubaix. The Tour of Flanders is the second hardest as it takes just over 4 participations. Now, I took part in that race 3 times, and although I'm no statistician, if I'm interpreting that data correctly, it's quite agonising to see that statistically I would have definitely won it if I'd raced it just 1 more time. And perhaps it is no surprise that the Tour of Lombardy is the lowest in this particular ranking, as it comes at the very end of the season. That is the point at which a large proportion of riders have already called time on their year, and the start list therefore is generally not as strong as the other monuments. Now, another related measure is the number of riders who've actually bucked the trend and managed to win one of these races at the first time of asking. Again, this is looking over the past 50 years, and again, it seems like what we could all have probably guessed, that Paris-Roubaix is the hardest classic of them all. No rider in the past 50 years has won the race on their debut, whereas at least 3 riders have won each of the 4 other ones at the first time of asking. The last rider to win a monument on their debut was none other than Mark Cavendish. He was riding Milan-San Remo for the first time when he pipped Heinrich Hausler on the line by a couple of centimetres all the way back in 2009. The last riders to do it in Flanders, Liège and Lombardy were, respectively, Paul Martins in 1982, Yevgeny Berzin in 1994 and Damiano Cunego in 2004. But nobody in the past 50 years has done it at Paris-Roubaix, and in fact it goes back even further than that. The GCN Nerdy Stats Department, to give them their proper name, have gone back as far as Jermaine Deric in 1953 as the last time a rider won Paris-Roubaix on their debut, and that was 67 years ago. However, the nerds we have in that department have asked me to say this, that it is notoriously difficult to determine riders who started but didn't finish races from that era. So if any budding cycling historians know if Deric had any DNFs at Paris-Roubaix before 1953, let us know in the comments below. So there we have it. The hardest classic to win is Paris-Roubaix. As for which one is the greatest? We'll leave that up to you to decide. Again, let us know in the comments which classic you think is the greatest of them all. Right, we're going to move on to some other news now. And first up, Team Astana's Davide Martinelli has swapped Lycra for courier clothing. He's volunteering to courier food and medicine to elderly people in his hometown of Lodeto near Brescia. Bernardino has auctioned off one of his many yellow jerseys to raise funds for his local hospital in Brittany. It fetched a whopping €12,000 over on eBay. Great stuff, Bernard. Giulio Ciccone has also donated a Tour de France yellow jersey, won last year. The Italian set up a GoFundMe page with the jersey going to the highest donation. He raised over €13,000. Adam Hansen is also doing his bit. So instead of making those custom aerodynamic shoes, the Aussie is now using his 3D printer to make masks and respiratory equipment for his local hospital. Michał Kwiatkowski is also doing his part. He owns a number of apartment buildings in Torun, Poland, which are now free for local medical staff to use. A brilliant gesture, I've got to say, at a time when hotels over there are closed. Meanwhile, teammate Luke Rowe came to the rescue after NHS worker Tom Roberts had his bike stolen. The Team Ineos rider replied to him and, after an exchange of messages, bought him a new one. Brilliant stuff. The Israel Startup Nation have secured 2,000 more masks for hospitals after their second medical aid ride on Zwift, and Movistar have teamed up with 100% to donate 250 pairs of glasses to a hospital in Barcelona. I have to say, there is a lot of good coming out of a bad situation right now. Moving on, the UCI have now officially suspended racing until the 1st of June, whilst ASO have said that they'll make a decision on whether the Tour de France will take place this year by May the 15th. Contrary to speculation last week though, Christian Prudhomme said that it will not take place behind closed doors, i.e. without spectators. Back to virtual racing now, and Thomas de Gendt found out last week that there is a downside to having so much power. He was disqualified from a Zwift race for putting out numbers so high they looked suspicious, or in Thomas's own words, superhuman. Not to be outdone, Ashley Moolman-Pasio of CCC suffered the same fate whilst doing a VO2 max workout. Zwift obviously just isn't used to the power of World Tour pros. That said, Jack Haig was pleased to break the top 10 in the Zwift race for the first time on Sunday, only to find out, through a reply on Twitter, that he was in the wrong category. This also appears to be the week that pro cyclists are using alternative apparatus for their home core workouts. So first up, the Koenig Quickstep's Mikel Honoré has been using his dog for a bit of extra weight bearing, whilst Jaakko Hanninen of AG2R has gone one better and used a calf. Matteo Trentin of CCC though is using the lightest and most precious training aid, his child. I love all those videos. Mike Woods of EF Pro Cycling is back on his bike. The Canadian fractured his femur in Paris-Nice just a few weeks ago, but is now doing recovery rides on his home trainer, which you can join in with every day at 1400 CEST on Zwift if you so wish. It'll probably be the only time we can keep up with him, so get in while you can. And finally, I've got some bad news for you. The 11th stage of the Tour de Quarantine was cancelled.
More drama than an episode of Tiger King. That's how fans are describing Stage 11 after officials abruptly canceled the stage because of unrideable conditions on this section of the course. You can see the flooding throwing water up onto the riders, and the officials tried to get heavy machinery in as quickly as they could to try to clear the way before the riders arrived. But that became clear that it would be impossible. There was just too much water to get the riders through safely. So officials deciding to take the time at the top of the last climb that they had gone over. Now, that'll be controversial because with just 3 more days of racing remaining at the Tour de Quarantine, riders are running out of opportunity to pick up GC time. You can see the confusion here as the 3 leaders got the information over their race radio, with Lady on the e-bike, Jimmy John's delivery rider, and Guy in orange showing the confusion as they were trying to figure out just what was going on. But eventually they did pull over and got the news that the stage had been canceled.
You can catch the full video and every stage of the Tour de Quarantine over on Brad Soner's YouTube channel. Right, that is all for this week. Don't forget to keep voting on the greatest classics rider of all time over on the GCN app. Some big competition going on over there. I hope you're all staying safe. I'll see you again next week. Bye for now.